Very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. In this morning session, we will be dealing with two important areas where we see a lot of controversy and litigation in transfer pricing. One is financial transactions, and second is intra-group services and reimbursements. The way I've structured this, the presentation slides that you have got, you will see a lot of material on the slide. I don't intend to walk through or talk about each of it. The reason I've put a lot of material so that it acts as a point of reference. The way I'll do it is we will go through some of the basics, some basic principles, and I will deal with some of the relevant case laws which will bring out the way the tax authority is looking at it and the way courts are looking at various issues. At any point, if there are any questions, please feel free to stop me on the way. Happy to take questions even while we are having the session. So, if one really looks at transfer pricing today, we all know that it's really a global phenomenon. Increasingly, tax authorities around the world are taking steps to protect their own tax base. Who would have heard of a company like Starbucks, for example, really a consumer company, would face a lot of hostility because it is perceived to have not paid its fair share of taxes in UK. Or Burger King, for example, doing some tax planning, gets a lot of negative press and loses its customers. So really, this whole principle of tax morality coming into the fore, the initiatives such as BEPS which have been taken. And even if one takes the example of the BEPS initiative, which is OECD and G20 initiative, out of the 15 action points which they have identified, 4 of them concern transfer pricing, and in fact a lot to do also with financial transactions. A lot of this is, as you know, really coming out of the economic crisis around the world, a global slowdown which has meant that each government, each tax authority wants to maximize its tax revenues. And increasingly, the onus is placed on the taxpayer to be able to demonstrate that what it is doing is in sync with commercial substance, and therefore transfer pricing really becomes very important, and especially so in financial transactions. So this is a statistics which I'm sure that at some point of time would have been shown to you. Just shows the magnitude of the transfer pricing dispute in India. As you will see from here, these are the 10 assessment years that have got closed after the introduction of transfer pricing provisions. The total adjustments that have been made aggregate to 2,71,000 crore rupees. So it's really a staggering sum, and if you see some of the last 2-3 years, the large numbers that you see here, some of them are really coming out of financial transactions like issue of shares, guarantees and so on. There were a lot of expectations, there were winds of change, new government coming into power, a lot was said. While there are certain changes that we are seeing, like for example, most notably would be post Bombay High Court Vodafone, which the government decided not to appeal against. But largely at a ground level, you still see that a lot of things have not changed, and in fact, if you would have seen the recent actions on FPIs and the kind of statements that were made by the finance minister, clearly this issue is not going to go away. Now, we start looking at financial transactions. What we'll first look at is you look at what are the basics. Now, when we talk about financial transactions, we're really talking about loans, guarantees. These would be the main 2 transactions, and there could be similar allied transactions. What is the main difference when we look at financial transactions? I would say the main difference is that they tend to be unique. You are unable to apply a profit-based method. So if you're, let's say, looking at a manufacturing operation or a service operation, you typically look at what is the margin that you earn Comparable data is easier to find. You have databases readily where you can find out the margins, do a comparison. As far as financial transactions are concerned, typically your profit-based methods or TNMM would not apply. So you would end up using a comparable uncontrolled price method or other method. Having said that, the availability of comparable data is always a challenge. You do not have sophisticated databases where these kind of comparable transactions will easily be available. So really you need to look at what is the internal data available within the taxpayer, the assessee's internal data. You can look at external data from countries which have more sophisticated databases available like the US. Also there is very little guidance available. So if you look at the income tax rules, there is nothing provided on how to benchmark these kind of transactions. So that leads to a great deal of subjectivity. And given the fact that typically your financial transactions tend to be of high value, even a small variation that is made by the TPO can result in a big adjustment. So there is always an incentive for the transfer pricing officer to make some variations in these prices which can get us big adjustments. If one looks at typical analysis, how you would do an analysis for financial transactions, essentially the principles remain the same. The comparability criteria, if you look at the rules, Rule 10b2 lays down what are the comparability criteria when you identify comparables. If you look at the various factors, look at characteristics. When you look at a loan transaction, for example, you would need to see what is the instrument, whether it's a loan, whether it's a debenture, whether it's a convertible instrument, what is the currency. So this would be the characteristic of the particular transaction. Then as far as the functional analysis is concerned, what is the role of the parties? Is the party in the business of lending, or is it a normal commercial transaction where a parent is lending to the subsidiary? So the functional characterization of the entity will determine the way in which you analyze it. What is the purpose of the lending? Is it a parent lending to a special purpose vehicle only to consummate a particular acquisition? Or is it a parent lending to a subsidiary for normal commercial operations? Is it an operating subsidiary, SPV? This would impact the analysis. Contractual terms. What is the tenor? What is the security? What are the covenants? What is the rate of interest? And finally, the economic circumstances. Because in financial transactions, the time period would be critical. What is the prevailing interest rate? What is the economic scenario at that point of time? What are the different market factors like currency rates, inflation, the inflation rate, and so on? Now, after identifying an uncontrolled transaction, what the rules require? You need to first identify an uncontrolled transaction, and then you need to make adjustments. What are the possible adjustments? To give you an example, you could have a identical company in the US, company in India. Both companies are borrowers. Let's say they have very similar kind of financial health, but your rate at which the US company would be able to borrow would in a given everything same, it will be lower than what the Indian company. The reason is that there is a difference in the sovereign risk. US would, let's say, carry a rating of AAA. India would have a sovereign rating of BBB. So that difference itself will be something that will affect the rate of interest. But this is something for which you can potentially make an adjustment. This is one example. There could be other examples where you can make adjustments. Now, what is really brought financial transactions? What has really brought greater focus to it? I would say one of the factors has been the economic crisis, and thereafter generally what has happened. If you see what is happening in Greece, what is happening to the euro, we keep talking about whether euro will remain, euro will not remain, whether Greece will remain within the common currency, whether it will go out. The oil crisis that you continuously have, Middle East, Russia, the low interest rate regime which has been followed by the developed world, which has created asset bubbles over the last several years. So these kind of factors have resulted in several situations, resulted in scarcity. Companies have had to actually rely on internal funds to do a lot of funding, intra-group funding, and this has brought greater focus of the tax authority on financial transactions. Also, countries have increased their focus in terms of legislation. So you would have countries which have got more strict in terms of the kind of thin capitalization rules that they would have, or the kind of focus that they would have on financial transactions. So you would have something like an Australian tax authority which has come out with a lot of guidance in terms of how they would look at financial transactions. So tax authorities have got more and more sophisticated and aggressive. Even if you look at it from an India perspective, the Indian TPOs, in my experience, have regarded financial transactions as some kind of a soft target. Again, there has been a lot of volatility. Even if you see the last 12-18 months, the kind of volatility we have seen with the rupee. So you see a lot of cases where so even if you see a cross-border funding, given the volatility in the currency rate, interest rate, there is a lot of ability for the tax office to challenge what has been done, because they would look at it, potentially 3 years after the event, and with a 2020 vision, and that is putting greater onus on the taxpayer to be able to demonstrate what it has done and to sort of get it right. Again, very little guidance available. There is the only position that the Indian Tax Authority has come out with is the India chapter in the UN Manual on Transfer Pricing, so which we will come to at a later point. But there is no practical guidance available in the income tax rules, and whatever we have is only by way of judicial precedent. Again, 2012, the introduction of capital financing definition in the explanation to section 92B, that has created its own set of challenges and controversy. Domestic transfer pricing, which is introduced, we have not really felt the heat because the assessments have not yet, they'll probably come up next year. So we've not really seen the heat of that. As far as safe harbor rules are concerned, while they were brought in, they've had very limited application because it's generally very restrictive. So let's look at some of the. So before we get into audit experiences, we will just quickly deal with the broad approach that is followed in benchmarking of interest. So when we are benchmarking interest, the starting point is always to determine the credit rating of the borrower. So that's the first step. And the second step is to identify comparable transactions based on that credit rating. So when you look at credit rating, this is the S&P scale. So AAA rated is the highest rated, B would be the lowest, BBB minus is the lowest for investment grade, anything above BBB minus is investment grade, below that is speculative. Similar rating scale is available in Moody's. So these are the two main rating agencies, and these are typically the rating scales that get used. So now practically, how do we go about determining a credit rating of a borrower? Now obviously, going to a rating agency and getting a rating is obviously an expensive exercise, but there are some tools available which can be very easily used to determine a credit rating. And one such tool is Damodaran's model. So this is Professor Ashwath Damodaran. He's a professor based in the US and NYU, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a model which he has come out with, which is publicly available and has in the past been used by tax authorities as well as taxpayers. Even Indian tax authorities have used it. So it's quite a reliable model. I'll just explain how it works. So if you see this example, you have this example of, so there is a balance sheet that you will see. This company has got a secured loan of 200, 12% secured loan. And if you see the profit and loss account, the earnings before interest and tax is 150, the interest is 24. Now what this model really does is to look at the interest cover ratio. So in this case, the interest cover ratio is 6.25. Now, so this is the step one. Step two is to then map this with the different slabs which are provided. This is again provided in the model itself. Now assuming that this is a large, so if you see the table on the right, they have given what the rating would be given a particular range of interest cover ratio. So this is what this is really where the Damodaran model comes in. So in this example, our interest cover ratio is 6.25, and assuming that this is a large company, if you see, it will fall within the third band, which is 5.5 to 6.5, and for this, the rating, the prediction of the rating will be A+. So again, please bear in mind that this is just a tool which, based on a certain model, helps you to predict a particular rating. Similar kind of a model is available there's a Moody's model which is also available, which we'll come to. But before we get to the Moody's model, just one other point which I think is very relevant is that one has to bear in mind what is the impact that the additional debt has on the balance sheet of the company. Because you could take on additional debt, but that additional debt will have an impact on the credit rating itself. So this is another example which we've given. On the left hand side, you see a company which has got a loan of 20, and in the right hand example, the loan goes up from 20 to 70. So if you see the impact of the debt interest coverage ratio, the interest coverage ratio of 5 goes down to 1.4. As a result, your rating will fall from A to B minus. Now what is the impact? If when you are evaluating any situation where you are doing an interest rate benchmarking, you could have a situation where you have a company which has got a proper healthy credit rating, but if the quantum of debt that is intended to be introduced is of such an order that actually the credit rating goes to let's say a junk grade, then potentially you may have to question whether this debt will actually get recognized as a debt or will get challenged by the tax authority. So this is another again a publicly available rating scale, which is this is a methodology of Moody's. Yes, sir.
What ground the tax authority will challenge it? If for my business I need some more loan, or if I'm taking some more loan, it definitely affects on my credit rating. But the tax authority will look at on which way?
No, so it's an absolutely valid point, and in fact I've dealt with this later on, which we'll discuss this in detail. But short answer is that as the law stands today, there is a strong case that the tax authority can do nothing, because until the GAR provisions are introduced, there is no way that they can recharacterize the debt into equity. But the reason I'm putting this is that looking at the way we are seeing tax authorities, getting newer and newer concepts, I feel it is still possible for them to argue that your debt, on an arm's length basis, you would not have been able to have that debt. So what they could do is do a comparison of your balance sheet with a comparison of your peer group. And let's say if you have a debt equity, let's say the peer group has a debt equity ratio of 2:1. And our debt equity ratio is, let's say, 99:1. That will clearly be absurd. But so I think the challenge, so practically what I advise clients to do is not to put structures which are extreme. if it's within certain parameters, it's okay, because today we don't have thin capitalization rules. I don't think till the GAR provisions are introduced, the tax authority can really challenge the capital structure unless it is really something which is extreme. But we'll come to this a little later. There are some decisions where I would like to discuss this. So coming to this Moody's rating methodology, this is just another methodology which is available on the Moody's website. They look at certain financial factors like profitability, liquidity, capital adequacy, asset quality, and there are certain non-financial factors. So again, there is clearly some element of judgment involved over here. It's not as formula based as the Damodaran model, but again it is known to give a reasonably reliable result. Other than this, so these two are very freely available. Anyone can access them. There are of course certain licensed models, like there is a model called RiskCalc which is used, widely used. But in my experience, and again this is something that I have discussed with a lot of people, in New York, Hong Kong, and people who have been exposed to this, far greater than what we have in India. And the feedback that I've got is that it's not necessary that just because there is a model which is licensed, it will give you a superior result. Because even that model is based on certain assumptions, and many times you are not able to show a tax authority as to what are the mechanics of that model, because you are really you input a certain set of numbers and you are getting a result. As against that, at least in a methodology like a Damodaran or a Moody's, at least it is something which is visible and transparent to the tax authority themselves. To my knowledge, till now our tax authority has not got any software which they have licensed. So they are typically using, they're using some approach like this. To my knowledge, they have not yet got any licensed software to do a credit rating. Okay. Now, what are the different factors which are relevant when benchmarking rate of interest? Obviously, the tenure of the loan, security, size of the loan, currency, the geography, and typically the search for comparable data. You can look at databases like the Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, Loan Connector. So some of these are licensed databases, and there is in fact a lot of data available in the US, because the US bond market is perhaps the most developed, and to that extent there is a lot of data available there. Some of the earliest guidance available on interest rate when benchmarking comes from the US 482 regulations, and they prescribe these factors which need to be looked at. So credit standing of the borrower, size of the loan, duration, currency, security, guarantee, and the prevailing interest rates. If you look at the India position, as I mentioned to you, the rules do not have any guidance on this, but there's an India chapter to the UN manual on transfer pricing, and in that the tax authority has given its position on how they would look at interest rate benchmarking. So some of the factors which they have come out, which are pretty normal, that what one would normally expect, except one, where they talk about the benchmarking for outbound loans. So where they say that in case of outbound loan transactions, they would look at the prime lending rate. So this is an area of I would say it's quite divergent from what is the international practice and what would appeal to us based on principles, and we will deal with a case law on this subject. But this is the main difference. Coming to the concept of thin capitalization, this is again a relevant concept as far as interest rate benchmarking is concerned. It essentially is a tool which tax authorities have to find out whether there is excessive amount of debt in the balance sheet. And to the extent that they believe that the debt is excessive, then to that extent they would disallow that interest based on thin capitalization. So at this point, India does not have thin capitalization, but with the GAR provisions, it is going to be introduced, whereby the tax authority will have the ability to recharacterize debt as equity. So typical approaches that are used for thin capitalization, certain countries have a prescribed norm. Like they will say that anything more than 2:1, 3:1, we will consider as thinly capitalized. Some countries have a interest cover type of an approach. Some countries will have an arm's length approach where they will say that, okay, you demonstrate that you are at arm's length based on whatever your peer group debt equity ratios are. Again, as I said, while we don't have thin capitalization in India today, it's still advisable to look at the capital structure and ensure that it is not excessively, there is excessive debt. Now, moving on to some decisions on interest rate benchmarking. Now, this is a landmark decision that's from the Delhi High Court, and it really settles a lot of key principles. So, briefly going through the facts, the taxpayer is a manufacturer. It has set up a subsidiary in the US for promoting, marketing, and promoting their exports. They have given a loan to the associated enterprise and charged interest at 4% per annum. They have used the cup method. The transfer pricing officer has alleged an interest rate of 14%, and they have relied on a number of factors like transaction cost and credit risk, etc. Now this table that you see, this is really brings out what the TPO has come out and this is what the TPO believes is the way in which they would look at a benchmarking. So if you look at the first column, they have said what is the primary consideration when the money is being lent by X to Y. So X is an Indian company lending to an overseas company. Primary consideration for X is to maximize its return in terms of interest. So essentially what they are advocating is that if you are lending to an overseas company, you need to look at what is the opportunity cost of that money. So if you could have parked it in a fixed deposit, and if you could have earned 10%, then they believe 10% is the right number. Now, when the X is a borrower, the primary consideration for X is to minimize its rate of interest, keeping in view the risk involved. So essentially what the tax authority is advocating is that when India is a borrower, then you should use LIBOR. But if India is a lender, then you should use prime lending rate. So it's something which is fundamentally contradictory, but this is the position that they have articulated, and this is exactly what comes out in the UN manual as well. So in this case, the DRP granted some partial relief, but that was not much. Tribunal had ruled in favor of the taxpayer, and the matter went to Delhi High Court. The Delhi High Court has laid down some very important principles. Firstly, they have said that the tax authority or the court, they cannot rewrite or recharacterize a transaction under normal circumstances. Second, it is not relevant what are the options available to the taxpayer. So if he has given a loan, you need to look at that loan and benchmark that loan. You cannot say that if he had deployed it in a fixed deposit, he would have got 10%. You could say that if he had deployed it in the business, his rate of return would have been 20%. That is not the correct approach. You need to look at the transaction and benchmark that transaction. You cannot have different parameters for inbound and outbound loans. Now again, this is a really practical issue, and we face this time and again, where let's say an Indian company, where the Indian company is a borrower, where let's say you have CCDs. A very common problem that we have with the TPO, the TPO will say that no, CCD, I will apply a LIBOR rate. Now CCD is by definition, it's a rupee denominated instrument. There is no way that you should be applying anything other than a rupee rate. But this is the position which at a TPO level is being taken, but this decision should actually help. Another important point they make is that what determines rate of interest is the currency in which the loan has to be repaid. I think this is the very most important principle which has now been brought up. And the prime lending rate is not applicable when it comes to overseas lending. India lending to overseas subsidiary, prime lending rate is not applicable. Now another issue that comes up very commonly is in relation to interest-free loans. A typical argument that a company makes is, I'm acting in the capacity of a parent company. It is really a shareholder activity. What I'm doing is nothing other than supporting my subsidiary. They would not have otherwise had the ability to borrow. What I'm really doing is, it's really quasi-equity in nature, and therefore there is no interest that I've charged. Now this is an argument which has not been accepted. This is a decision, Pero Systems, Delhi Tribunal decision, and this is consistently being followed in a lot of cases. So typically arguments like the low income theory or shareholder activity, these are arguments that are not being accepted. I would still like to make a point that perhaps there could be some case, some situation where you may be able to have an argument as far as shareholder activity is concerned, but that is something probably the courts will, maybe a high court will have to decide on this point. Moving on to another decision, this is another issue that comes up is the cost of funding. Is that a relevant factor? So today, if I say that I have a nil borrowing cost, is it a relevant factor? When I'm giving a loan. Again, this is a Mumbai Tribunal decision in BVF, and this is again consistently followed. Answer is no. You need to look at a comparable transaction. In this case, there was another loan which they had from a third-party bank, which they said that is the correct comparable, not your internal cost of funding. Okay, what is the kind of documentation that one would require to maintain? Certain type, so one would be the basic legal documentation in terms of the contracts and so on. Then you would have the benchmarking analysis, which would constitute your analysis of the credit rating, analysis of your comparable transactions and so on. And you may also want to keep certain backup documents like quotations from banks as a corroboratory evidence. So moving on to an allied issue, which is in relation to accounts receivable. Now, prior to 2012, an argument was possible that accounts receivable, so which is really, you have a sale, you have debtor, that debtor is outstanding for, let's say, more than 30 days, 60 days, whatever the norm is. So anything that is long outstanding, is it a separate international transaction? So prior to 2012, a view was possible that this is really part of a single international transaction. It's not a separate international transaction. However, the explanation that was introduced in 2012 to Section 92B, thereafter this may be a challenge. But still, the question would arise as to whether you would have to charge interest in each case that there is a overdue receivable. Now, there could be, clearly there are factors like commercial expediency, industry practice. Taking example of a software industry, it would be common practice to give a long period of credit to the customer, and this would happen in third-party situations. So if it's an industry practice, why should you in a related party situation be compelled to charge interest? And again, it may be driven by the customers. You could have an Indian company, you have a subsidiary in the US which is in turn contracting with the customer, and the Indian company has not received the money because the subsidiary has not received the money. So in this situation, it makes no sense for the Indian company to charge interest to the subsidiary. So one way to really look at this is, if you look at Rule 10A, which says that transaction includes a number of closely linked transactions. So essentially the proposition is that your account receivable is a closely linked transaction to your main transaction of either export or provision of service. And then if you are following the transactional net margin method, so if you really see I'll just read this out, the net profit margin arising from a comparable uncontrolled transaction is adjusted to take into account differences, if any, between the international transaction and the comparable uncontrolled transaction, or between the enterprises entering into such transaction which could materially affect the amount of net profit margin in the open market. Okay. Now proposition is that what if I do a working capital adjustment? When I am doing a working capital adjustment, I am essentially aligning the working capital level of the comparable to the working capital level of the tested party or the assessee. So by doing that, I am removing whatever difference is there on account of this differential credit period. So potentially this could be an approach where if you aggregate these transactions, do T&MM, and under a after doing a working capital adjustment, if the margin of the taxpayer is higher than the margin of the comparables, then an argument is possible that whatever effect of the higher credit period that you may have given gets subsumed in the higher margin that you have got. So this is a potential argument which can be used. Now moving on to this, this is an important decision of the Bombay High Court in relation to receivables. Now in this case, the assessees, Indo-American Jewelry, they were not charging interest from the associated enterprise and not charging interest from third parties as well. So what the High Court has held is that there is clearly a uniformity of action. You are not charging interest from a related party, you are not charging interest from third party, and therefore there is no adjustment that is warranted. Now although this decision is post 2012, they have not really dealt with the amendment and what is the impact of the explanation on this. So that's the one part that is not dealt with, but nonetheless it's a post 2012 decision. Similar case in where in case of non-AEs, the maximum delay was about 203 days. But in the case of associated enterprise, the delay was more than 1200 days. So what the tribunal has held is that if you allowed 200 days credit to third party, use that. Anything excess of that is only what is liable to interest. Tech Mahindra, again there are two principles that come out. First principle is that if you are not charged interest to a third party, then there is no requirement for you to really charge interest to your related party. This is same as what the Bombay High Court has said. Second is that the interest, if at all interest is to be charged, it should be in relation to the country where the debt is arising. Tooltech, in this case there was a outstanding receivable which got converted into a loan, and what was held is that the interest should only be charged from the date of conversion. Now moving on to guarantees and letters of comfort, I'll just maybe start with an example to just highlight what kind of this
regarding this receivables, right? I have just faced transaction. I just would like to ask you what's your feedback and your experience. They have just started giving credit of just 30 days. So we had this one transaction, right, where we didn't have the comparable transaction. And we argued that we have already said that if we don't receive within 12 months, right, it was a capital asset sale, right, then we would charge so and so interest. Right? We have received in 12 months because there was some milestones. Now the department, the DPO said, so there is no comparable transaction, right? I would give you just 30 days. Beyond 30 days, I would be charging you SBI, PLR plus. So what do you think? I don't think this kind of actions of them would be
clearly he should have a basis of why 30 days. Right. And even if you see like today when you're dealing with even the advanced pricing agreement, APA authorities, they're also looking more like a 60-day period, even as a discussion. So 30 days I think is a little extreme. Maybe we can, maybe after offline we can talk about this. But in principle, the transfer pricing officer clearly not justified in doing this. He would have to have some basis, and likewise, you would need to have a basis as to why you have decided a certain credit period. So whether it's an industry practice or whatever, you will also need to have a basis. Okay, so moving on to, as I'll just quickly take you through what the issue here would be. So you have, let's say, a taxpayer which is an Indian company. It has set up a subsidiary, SPV, in order to make an acquisition. Now, the Indian company has given a corporate guarantee to a third-party bank. On the basis of that corporate guarantee, the third-party bank has given a loan to the SPV, and the SPV has utilized the loan to acquire the target company. Very common kind of arrangement. Now, in this kind of a situation, whether a guarantee fee should be charged. Now, this issue has, came up, in fact, resulted in a very large adjustment. Matter went to a petition to the Bombay High Court. And essentially, the way the department had approached it, the department had just done a naked credit rating of the subsidiary of the SPV. Obviously, the SPV is set up. It's a company with no assets, nothing. Obviously, the credit rating will be jumped. If you look at the difference between the Indian company and that, you'll have a huge number. In fact, they attributed something like 10% as the guarantee fee, which was 3 times more than what the actual cost of funding was. So this is the kind of absurdity that is today the kind of absurdity that we are seeing when it comes to guarantees. And even practically 10% may be an extreme example which happened in that particular case. But even today, it's very common for transfer pricing officers to allege anything from 2 to 3% as a guarantee fee. So again, in terms of, I won't read through this, very clearly, a guarantee is something which will only happen in a parent-subsidiary relationship where a parent needs to give that support to a subsidiary to enable the subsidiary to borrow and actually be creditworthy. In a normal parent-subsidiary relationship, the parent is not in the business of giving a guarantee, unlike a bank. That's an important distinction. Now, there are arguments possible that what you're doing really is a shareholder activity and you really ought not to have to charge anything for that guarantee. But conversely, from a transfer pricing perspective, the view is that this is really a service. You are giving a benefit to the subsidiary and therefore some kind of a charge is warranted. Now, key principles that come into a guarantee benchmarking is first whether to be charged or not to be charged. For that, an important factor is whether there is an explicit guarantee or is it an implicit guarantee. What is the implicit guarantee? Let's say you are a subsidiary of the Tata Group. There is an implicit guarantee that the Tata Group, to maintain its reputation, will not allow you to go belly up. So there is an implicit guarantee. So if I am a lender, I am lending to such a company, I will lend on the basis that it has a Tata parentage. An explicit guarantee is where the Tata parent has actually given me a letter saying that I confirm that I am stand guarantor. So then I have a legal recourse to the Tata Group. So this will have an impact on the benchmarking. Other principles are very similar to what we saw in the benchmarking for loans. And we have an example of what kind of approach is typically followed for finding out what the guarantee fee should be, which we'll come to later. What are the views from a taxpayer's perspective? One view is that I should not have to charge because I am doing this as a parent. Second is if there is a service involved, I should find out what is the benefit that are given to the subsidiary, and some portion of that benefit should be charged out. The tax department's approach is that they're just doing as I said, just looking at the naked credit rating of the subsidiary, looking at the difference, entire benefit is being attributed as a guarantee fee. They are also looking at quotes available from websites of banks. So where typically a bank will say that, okay, I give a guarantee ranging from 0.3% to 4%, and based on that they'll pick up some magic number which they feel is correct and they will apply that as a guarantee fee. Like we saw for loans, there is really no guidance available on guarantee fees except the India chapter in the UN manual, where the Indian Tax Authority has given its view, and essentially they do mention that they would look at quotations available from banking companies. Now this is an international case law, but it's a landmark decision as far as guarantee benchmarking is concerned, and it's very really brings out very clearly what are the principles involved. So here you have GE Canada. It's a company engaged in certain financial activities in Canada. They have done local borrowing of funds, and in 1995, the US company, which is the parent of the Canadian company, started charging a guarantee fee of 1% per annum of the outstanding debt. The Canadian Revenue Authority disallowed this deduction. However, the court ruled in favor of the taxpayer, held that this is a legitimate charge. Now, this is where we have a concept of implicit support and explicit support coming in. Now, what is implicit? As I mentioned, what is implicit support? Implicit support is that GE Canada is a subsidiary of GE US, and therefore, merely by its association with GE would not have allowed that company to fail, and therefore, it will always enjoy a certain credit rating. That is implicit support. Explicit support is only what is the benefit it gets in terms of credit rating by an actual exchange of letters. And what the tax authority held is that it is only the explicit support which is what you can charge for. Now the explicit support, now in this particular case, the explicit support, so if you see interest cost saving based on differential between BBB minus and BB plus was determined to be approximately 1.83%. Now this is the benefit, 1.83% is the benefit that GE Canada got as a result of an explicit guarantee provided by the parent company. Now obviously that entire 1.83% is not something that can be paid as guarantee fee, because you will of course share it between the two, and based on that they said okay, 1% is a reasonable number which you can pay.
Now, if you write a very current, very low interest rate regime, how far this very old decision, say about 20-25 years old, where 1% or 1.8% was held. Now when the regime is of 0.25%,
Fair point.
so how
Fair
does
point.
it work?
Well, I think the principle will remain the same, because you will just have to, because there will still be a cost attached to the borrowing, because the numbers that you are talking about, that would be the Fed rate. And actually, when the loans are given to borrowers, there will obviously be a spread which is added by the bank. So, and there will be some interest saving which would arise as a result of the guarantee, and that there will be some sharing of that which would represent your guarantee fee.
So now the guarantee fee should be far lower than.
So this 1% I don't, so okay, it's not meant to be indicative of what a correct number should be. It is just the principle. So that number could very well be low today. I take your point, but this is just to illustrate the principle. Coming to some Indian case laws on guarantees, this is a decision which is prior to 2012. Here it was held that the guarantee is not an international transaction. Of course, this was prior to the explanation, which has now very clearly guarantee is an international transaction. So this decision will no longer be applicable. These are a couple of decisions, Asian Paints and Everest Canto, both Mumbai tribunal decisions, where the Indian companies had provided a corporate guarantee to a local branch of a foreign bank. The foreign bank had charged them some fee for it, and the Indian company had cross-charged this fee to the overseas subsidiary who were the beneficiary of the guarantee with a small markup. The tax authority had used a rate from the website. This was held to be not valid, and it ruled in favor of the SSA. Now, this whole issue of whether a guarantee is an international transaction or not, once again sort of got revisited by this decision of the Delhi Tribunal of Bharti Airtel. Now in this case, once again they have said that even after the introduction of this explanation, if there is no cost that the guarantor has borne, so there is no impact on the guarantor's profit, income, losses or assets, then there should not be any requirement to charge a guarantee fee. So this is the principle coming out. Having said that, so while this is a very good decision, very well reasoned out, to my mind there are two fallacies, I shouldn't say fallacies, but two reasons why I would not really go and plan on the basis of this decision. Firstly, because there are certain mitigating facts where in this particular case, the actual facility was not drawn down by the subsidiary. So guarantee was given, there was no cost attached to the guarantee, and the actual amount, which a facility that was available to the subsidiary was not drawn down. So there was actually not even a potential liability that could have fastened on to the guarantor. And second, I don't think they have adequately considered the aspect of whether this can really be a service, because clearly you have provided a service to the, so whether the facility is drawn down or not, to my mind, the fact that they had that facility is a service and a benefit that is provided. I don't think that has been adequately covered. So while this is a good decision in case you need to defend the case, I would not say that I would not recommend using this decision for planning purposes. Okay, coming to Glenmark Pharmaceuticals, this is a Mumbai tribunal decision which has essentially recognized that there are certain conceptual differences between a corporate guarantee and a bank guarantee. So again, this was a case where the EPO had used website rates available from bank website. Clearly the tribunal has held that there are these conceptual differences. Banks are in the business of giving a guarantee, and you cannot just merely apply rates from the website for making adjustments. Coming to letters of comfort, again, a letter of comfort is something which is not really a... Yes, sir.
Only, are there any comparable international decisions imposing upon the taxpayer the necessity of mandatorily charging interest or guarantee fee? Because the G Canada which you have shared, G Canada was a case where the company charged the guarantee fee and the tax department was contesting the payment of guarantee fee. Here there is the opposite position, that the department is saying that it should charge interest and guarantee fee for corporate guarantees, corporate loans given for purposes, because the way the law is being interpreted, it will hamper the growth and development of Indian business, particularly multinational business.
Correct. So absolutely right. In fact, after the Bharti Airtel decision, one of the articles written by Mr. T.P. Ostwal is, brought out this point that India, the inbound FDI is much more than ODI. So if you were to, what if foreign tax authorities start levying this kind of a guarantee fee? Would India allow a payout? And actually it will be to India's disadvantage to have this. So point taken. What the mature tax jurisdictions, the way they will look at it is that it would be your obligation as a parent to bring your subsidiary up to a level where they are credit worthy. So let's say that BBB minus is an investment grade. So to the extent that you are giving a parental support which helps them to come to that level of being credit worthy, that should be treated as a shareholder activity. And any benefit which is beyond that, only that is something that you may consider as a service which is provided. But I have not come across any kind of a compulsion. Like I can tell you from the US, there was no compulsion to charge guarantee for each and every case.
India is a unique tax jurisdiction with regard?
No, I think, see, I'm seeing a lot of pressure nowadays from Australia. In fact, Australia, there is a lot of changes happening in the last 1 year where they are really fundamentally changing the way they are approaching transfer pricing. In fact, if some of those principles come into India, we will have a far more difficult task at hand. But I'm seeing, increasing guarantee, coming in from Australia. This is one jurisdiction I've seen. But I don't think it is as aggressive. And I think, one of the points is that obviously everything in India is getting into a litigation. So a lot of these things may get settled by those tax authorities without really going to the courts.
Here even the demand or extent of addition is also huge,
Yes.
disproportionate.
Okay. So moving on to letters of comfort. So again, this is something that falls short of a guarantee. Essentially, it can be something as innocuous as telling a bank that this is my group company and it is my general policy to ensure that we meet our obligations. It can be something as innocuous as that, or it could be something which is saying that okay, we will support if and when there is a requirement. The key here is that what is the standing of that letter under the common law of the country in which it has been provided. So there could be, and there are a lot of litigation on this, not transfer pricing related, but common law related. In every country, whether this kind of a letter will this be considered a guarantee? Will they actually fasten a legal liability to the provider of such a letter? That is an important determination. But from an India perspective, any kind of a letter that is provided will necessitate some kind of a charge. So, very clear position taken by Indian tax authorities. Any kind of a comfort letter, they are insisting upon a charge. Infusion of share capital. If we were having this discussion maybe 8 months ago, this would have probably been the most important topic. Now I think it's slightly receded, so we can quickly run through this. So essentially the issue was that Indian company issuing shares to an overseas company, whether you need to do a transfer pricing of that. Indian tax authority was doing a fair based on certain valuation parameters, making adjustments and attributing income in the hands of Indian company. As you all know, Bombay High Court in the case of Vodafone and Shell has ruled that this cannot be done. There cannot be a transfer pricing adjustment. You first need to have income. Having said that, the only relevance here is that even today, as far as reporting obligations are concerned, if you look at the Shell decision, even in case of issuance of share, there is no dispensation from the reporting obligation. So it is very important that these transactions do get reported because there is a potential penalty implication for non-reporting. So again, this is just the kind of changes that have happened from a regulatory perspective. So earlier on we had the CCI guidelines, then we had the DCF method, and now it is any internationally accepted methodology. So clearly, I think after the recent decision of the government to not appeal the Vodafone decision to the Supreme Court, this issue seems to have died down, but nonetheless it's important that a reporting is done to protect from penalties. Now moving on to intra-group services including reimbursements. So again, this is one more area which has seen a lot of disputes. Again, it stems from a pressure that tax authorities around the world have had to insist that taxpayers actually charge out. So to give you an example, the US tax authority came out with the services regulations in 2006. As a result of this, what happened was that they significantly narrowed down what could be termed as a shareholder activity. So as a result, a lot of services which otherwise they would have not charged out, they were compelled to charge out, otherwise they would have faced a disallowance. And similar kind of a pressure we've seen from other tax authorities. That's the reason we are seeing a lot of increase in the quantum of these intra-group service charges. So again, there are some typical examples of these intra-group services. The broad principles are that is the service conferring a benefit? If so, then it can be charged. If it is not providing any benefit, it should not be charged. This is the broad principle. From an assessment perspective, we have really seen that the transfer pricing officers consider intra-group services as some kind of a low-hanging fruit. So, practical experience is that there is a presumption that these are nothing other than profit extraction tools, and the likelihood is that any intra-group service will likely be disallowed unless you are really able to, give some substantial documentation to defend it. Now, typical problems that arise is that there is a clear expectation mismatch between what is expected from a documentation perspective in India and the way this would be looked at from an overseas perspective. So typically when you are talking to clients, a lot of data that you require to defend these kind of charges you would need from an overseas office. Now, their view of the matter is that we have an OECD compliant policy, we have a document, we have identified that these services are beneficial in nature, not duplicative, not shareholder activities. We have undertaken a study, we are charging a proper markup, we have proper allocation fees. This is their view of the world. Indian tax authority will say that okay, fine, all this is fine, this is theory. You show us what is the document available, what was the need for you to have taken this service, what is the benefit, and so on. So there is a clear mismatch in terms of the expectation, and that is actually what increases the challenge a great deal. So some of the key issues for consideration here. So first is a need test. In order to demonstrate, establish the need that these kind of services were required. Benefit test. Benefit test is to be able to show that the Indian company has actually benefited. So whether it has increased my sales, increased my profitability, added to my customer list, some kind of a tangible benefit. Evidence that the services are received. The documentation to be able to show that, let's say there was someone, if you say that there was a training imparted, then how was it imparted? Was it by way of a webinar? Was it by way of a personal visit? If there was supervision, how that supervision happened? If there was some technical support, how that technical support was actually delivered, and so on. And finally, the arm's length determination, which would again is very closely linked with these factors. So what you will need is global documentation which will really speak to the cost base, how the allocation keys have been arrived at, whether it is beneficial, not beneficial, how have they taken out the shareholder activities, duplicative activities. And the more important part is the India documentation, which is really going to be determinative of whether you will succeed in getting a deduction or not.
I mean, here one practical problem which we face
Yes, sir.
is that there is a constant churn at the Indian subsidiary, regional office, head office. So the tenure of the people who are in the know, hardly 1 year, 2 years, barely one finds that the person is there for 3 years or 5 years. So by the time the matter is at the TPO level or at the appeal level, so though there is, the evidence would be there, somewhere in the computer system of the authority, but people, and with the very thin team, it is not practically possible to find out. Because everything is archived, So we have seen for day-to-day even matters of 1 year old, 18 months old, we are not able to get that. So sometimes we are able to get the evidence of rendering of service, but the benefit test with a certain function are not handled at all. Though there may be a designation, certain functions cannot be handled at the Indian level, they may be at the regional level, in the post chart. So this proving this becomes very difficult.
I think it's a very important point you're making, and in fact, in a couple of the case laws we have probably dealt with this, but completely agree. This is really the crux of the issue, practical challenge, and there is really no one answer that will fit all the cases. I mean, in my experience, the number of clients which I would be representing, As I said, large number of cases, the TPO will simply disallow them, say that ALP is 0. 100% disallowed, ALP is nil. This is a very common experience. And in fact, we really get some really sort of shocked people overseas. They say, how can your transfer pricing officer say that arm's length price is nil? We do so much. And as you rightly said, the challenge is in really showing that, okay, what is that so much? Please, translate it in terms of if you actually go to see, what are the emails, and again, getting data of that relevant period becomes a challenge. Yes, sir.
A very detailed questionnaire, almost 40 questions are there. When you go for the duty assessment,
Yes.
and then you produce these documents, like the employee there, their code, man hour, then costing. You give us detail, we will surely give you. But what TPO says, 90% plus SSCs don't submit anything except for email communication. They have nothing except for email communication between the two parties. So what's your practical call where it is allowed, what was submitted actually?
Again, I'll share with you again, this is in the public domain, so I can take a name over here. This is a case, Mumbai Tribunal decision of Dresserland. This is a case which we have represented. Now, what was really done and what is, what convinced the tribunal is again just the volume of information. So somehow I feel that a lot of paper is what helps.
Many people do emails, you send query and you reply.
Yeah, so a combination of emails, a combination of again it's difficult to pinpoint. Again, this will be so fact specific, but wherever we have succeeded, I feel that is based on, okay, whatever data there is, someone has to spend time. Someone has to spend time from the client side, the consultant side. Someone really has to spend time to get to the facts. And again, I think in some certain cases the intra-group charge sometimes in certain cases it is excessive. I mean, that's also equally true. So in all cases may not also be defendable.
I think would it help if the technology related postings are separated from the management fees? Because what I have found when I go to a substantially large portion, maybe sometimes as much as 75-90%, pertains to the common software, email, maintenance of because the server in all the cases is same, particular. So large portion of the expense is that. So if that is separated from other management services, will it not greatly help?
It does. In fact, this is the strategy that we do follow, at least to take out the technical. Because at least it's easier to identify what should be the cost attributable, because at least you have some measure like number of users or number of licenses on the basis of which proportion. But again, nowadays the challenge is that which you are facing. In fact, where the TPO says that you could have got this service from a local vendor at 1/3 of the cost. Now, I think that is not, I don't think it should be in his domain to really say that. But this is the challenge that we are facing, that okay, why did you need a SAP consultant globally? Locally if you had got a consultant, they could have done it at whatever, 1/3 of the cost. That is the challenge. But other than that, yes, carving out technology helps a lot.
It's my business decision.
Yes.
You can't tell me go back to a class train or taxi.
Yeah.
Even now
In fact, even I think
confidential.
for AI, when these intragroups have been made in nil,
In fact,
you cannot make it.
what I'll do is, in fact, this is a decision, if you see, Cushman and Wakefield. This is one of the more recent decisions on this issue, where they have laid down the principle. In this case, there was a cost-to-cost reimbursement. So there was a allocation of cost to India for certain services, which were being rendered. transfer pricing officer had again held that the ALP should be nil. Tribunal had ruled in favor. The argument that was taken by the taxpayers' council was that this is a case where section 92 subsection 3 should apply, and 92.3, as you know, is where if it results, if a transfer pricing adjustment results in lowering of the taxable income, then TP provision should not apply. So the argument taken was that because I have been charged only costs, if I had to attempt a arm's length computation, then it would have been cost plus something, and that plus something would have increased my deduction, and therefore 92.3 should apply. Now here the court has held, and to my mind rightly so, that merely because they have charged cost, that doesn't mean that because it's arm's length. Because if it's a related party transaction, then even the cost also is something that can be questioned. Because admittedly a third party would have charged you cost plus something, but that cost could have been lower. But a principle that they have laid down is that you cannot question the commercial wisdom of the taxpayer. That is something, it's the prerogative of the taxpayer, you cannot question that. Neither the tax authority nor the courts. Also, if you see, there is this other ruling, McCann Erickson. Right? This is a case where again it involved an intra-group service where the assessee, it was a part of the IPG group, and it availed certain management and coordination services from its associated enterprises. And the basis of charge was a cost allocation plus a 5% markup. In this case, the taxpayer had used TNMM. They had a margin of 26% as against comparable which were at 8%. Again, the TPO had held that the arm's length price is nil. But what the taxpayer was able to demonstrate is that through a lot of detailed documentation, they were able to demonstrate that as a result of these services, they had access to some of the best talent in the world. As a result of the access to that talent, they were able to win some very significant jobs. So they were able to establish the need, they were able to establish the benefit, they were able to establish how the services were delivered. So whether they were delivered by email, by personal visits. So the documentation, and in fact the decision also clearly brings that out in a tabular form, what kind of data was submitted by the taxpayer. So here I would say the key takeaway from this decision of McCann Erickson is that based on documentation and based on the trail that they were able to establish between the cost incurred and the benefit, based on that they were able to get a relief. But similarly in this other decision that I have, GEM Plus, here on again some intra-group services, the whole challenge was that the taxpayer was not able to establish the benefits. I think it's very fact specific, and it's really how you are able to convince the tax officer in each individual case. So I think that really brings me to an end to my presentation. So any questions, I'm happy to take them.
How is the intra-group services treated globally? What is the view of other countries?
Globally, the experience is that, so at least in the OECD countries, they will follow the OECD principles. But if you look at some of the, so like I'll give you an example of Indonesia, very similar kind of challenges what we have in India. I think China is also a similar kind of story, but China, I think a lot of the restrictions are more from a exchange control perspective, where a lot of these payments, they do not allow a lot of payments. And once, so a lot many times in China they get pre-agreed, so they'll get into an APA or something, and only then they will have these kind of charges. I think in India what happens is that why these things get magnified is because of the uncertainty.
Now, the MNCs are going for APA only on this management services?
Yes, they are going for it, but again, when so clearly this is one area where APA, ideally should work. I am not aware of a single APA which has got concluded only on reimbursements. So you said there could be two kind of APIs. One would be where reimbursement or intra-group services is one of the transactions, and where you are also offering an income side. So maybe your proposition is that I will give you a profitability of, let's say, 18%, but then as part of that 18% I have some income and some expenses. That could be one situation. Second situation is I go to an APA only to ask for a determination on what should be the ALP of my intra-group payout costs. I think the second type will be a little more difficult. As yet, no APA to my mind has got concluded on this issue. I know of APAs which have got filed on these kinds of issues, but I think it is still early days. We'll have to see how, firstly, we'll have to see how the APAs get concluded, and secondly, and more importantly, the compliance audit in these kind of situations will be key. Because if I get an APA saying that I agree that this is the correct methodology and your apportionment keys are correct, but annually TPO will have to examine your benefit test, then to my mind that APA will be meaningless. So unless I can get something from an APA very prescriptively, that these are the 20 things that I need to keep to be able to show the benefit, then that will have some value to me.
Is it necessary that there has to be a benefit? See, there could be a project which is conducted by the parent globally for the benefit of all the subsidiaries, and they're going to charge it to them. But suppose it got aborted because of something. Is it absolutely necessary?
No, so I think in fact, I'm dealing with a live issue on this. So at that point of time, it was necessary for your business. So at the time you incurred, you had an expectation that, let's say there is some new market that let's say e-commerce. I wanted to do something in e-commerce. I have started some project. I have incurred some costs, which were incurred for the purposes of my business. The fact is that may not have succeeded. That's separate. But I think the benefit in any case, regardless of transfer pricing, even if you look at Cushman & Wakefield, they have said, in fact, put the onus on the assessing officer to examine benefit from a Section 37 perspective. So I think the threshold is in fact higher now. So I think, to my mind, benefit will have to be examined.
See, Taleb, lot of management expenses pertain to the domain of policy making, global coordination, control and direction rather than operations. So the TPO wants benefit test in terms of operations of the Indian unit, whereas the expenses at the regional or head office level are incurred on the management team with a view to have one global policy and controlling and coordinating the operations globally, say for inventory. Something which is in demand in India, not moving somewhere, we will move it. So unless the role of the head office or region is that of a sutradhar, they will not be handling the operations. So if you are asked to prove the benefit test, how do I prove the benefit test? Because the Indian managing director is more like a COO, chief operating officer, rather than the CEO. The CEO is sitting at the region or at the. So how this aspect can be impressed? These all expenses are at the policy level, going the direction, because they are, if the Indian CEO will look at the operations in India, whereas the CEO is sitting in the region, or head office will look at the global competition.
Sure. I think fair point. We'll have to show two things. One is that what is being done at a regional level is something different and incremental to what is already happening in India. So taking your example of, let's say there is some sophisticated inventory management system that is in place and which is benefiting India. I think that benefit, now question is how that benefit gets quantified is a second issue, but at least to establish that there is a benefit accruing to India as a result of this, I think that can be done. Another example, you can have situations where you have, let's say, a business manager sitting in a region who is looking at some global big clients. He is managing that global relationship with that client. As a result of that, many countries get business, including India. Again, you can establish that there is a direct linkage between the activities of that individual and or that process and what is accruing to India in terms of additional business. quantification again, I would agree, will be a challenge. But I think if it is, the distinction we'll have to make is that when you talk about coordination, what is it something which is more internal, focused towards, if it's, let's say, something focused towards internal MIS, then clearly it ought not to be charged. But if it is something to do with the operations and the business, I think there's a good case for it to be charged out.
Raman, on issue of shares, can you put some more light what your ethical advice? The valuation methods are many now, but what generally a better way for?
Practically, I would say it would still be a good idea to do a proper valuation. And again, the preference is to do a DCF is clearly something which the tax authority does prefer. So I would still, I'm advising my clients to still do a proper valuation, report the transaction.
Yes. Let's say there's a joint venture abroad where we have an Indian partner and a foreign partner. But if it is a joint venture, let's say for doing a business. Now it so happens that many times the Indian promoter is able to contribute more on account of finance, etc. Now in such a case, let's say the company has got a certain amount of reserves, etc. Now Indian promoter wants to contribute more capital at say a face value. Now by the Vodafone issue said that the share subscription will not lead to a income under transfer pricing, but they never dealt with section 56, I believe. Now in such a case where the Indian party wants to invest at let's say less than book value of the company, would section 56 get triggered and would that have any other implication under transfer pricing rules?
So you're
getting share at a discount, let's say, discount to the book value or the fair value.
You're talking about an Indian company will be investing in a foreign company and getting shares at a less than book value. So I think one will have to see. One thing is that section 92(3). Now, technically speaking, I don't know to what extent 92(3) will apply here, but for you, this is a cost of acquisition for you.
Yeah.
It's a capital transaction, but it's a cost of acquisition also. But tomorrow when I dispose of those shares, this will be my cost of acquisition. So if I increase it, so if I have transacted at a certain value, and if I increase it, then that will actually result in a reduction for me.
Yeah.
So I think.
But in the section 56,
It's the opposite.
It should be income.
Yeah.
Has anything like this come up anywhere?
Don't have an answer for it right now.
This share price issue price, it has come up globally also? Or is it peculiar?
No, this was an India issue where India sort of, so globally this would have come, but I tell you, so taking an example of, let's say, the issue price, by manipulating the issue price, if you are able to shift value from shareholder A to shareholder B, then yes, there is a tax implication between the two shareholders may be interstate, but it cannot be something which you can tax in the hands of the Indian company. Now, that being said, in certain countries there are specific regulations where they would require issue of shares to be at a at arm's length price or fair value, but those norms are all prescribed in advance. So in fact, when this issue came up, I was talking to one of our, we obviously felt it was completely ridiculous. I was talking to a senior person. He was formerly with one of the big four firms, and then now with one of the clients. And he was telling me that it's not as ridiculous as what you think. There are a lot of countries which do this, but there it is it's well laid down in advance.
Another issue comes that the entire matter of valuation is so amorphous. So I would take in any company, if Rakesh Jhunjhunwala or Ratan Tata or Narayan Murthy, who are considered to be savvy investors or managers or ability to think ahead 5 years, 10 years. The moment they take a 10% stake, 5% stake, it brings such a confidence in other investors that the price jump by 100%. So at a later date, how does the company justify the price at which they issue the shares to Tata or Modi or anybody? Because they are coming in the company, increases the valuation of the company. Then tomorrow the tax authority will say that the issue to them was underpriced. If they go out, the value will fall. So how to deal with these issues? Because so far it is coming under transfer pricing. And as Naresh said, tomorrow this issue will come under section 50.
In fact, these things have started coming already. Not that it's already started coming.
Or say Alibaba takes a stake in the company, the valuation to the because then it gives a signal to the other investor, yes, this business model is working. What is the defense? How does one prepare for the defense?
So, really speaking, we don't know what the tax authority is going to do, so we'll have to. Because this and we are seeing a lot of. And I know what you're talking about. A lot of using even I've seen that them using Section 69. So a lot of these things we are seeing.
Okay.
Okay,
And I
thank
know
you.
It is bothering my mind. I think the whole thing.
Yeah.
I am sure after hearing him and all the queries, he has really done an excellent job. May I request Jay Kalra to please propose a very, very well-deserved vote of thanks.
Dignitaries on the dais, of the dais, and dear friends. I believe that we all are very lucky to be present here and to have been through this presentation. It was a very, very detailed presentation. He presented before us a plethora of case laws and case studies. He shared his experiences, his knowledge. He answered most of our queries. And I personally gained a lot from this session. I feel everyone here would agree with me.